Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's talk, which is the first lecture here of what has shaped up, was not intentional, but has shaped up as not only a busy week, but also a very Anatolian week. And so, yes, which is to the advantage of several of you. And we're starting with a great talk in that regard, because it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Tamar Hodos, with whom I've been in contact and working with for quite a bit of time. And Tamar is one of those Mediterranean archaeologists who, well, we've had more of those around in the Institute, but not so many of them come around, who actually work throughout the whole Mediterranean. Because she began when she was working on the doctoral dissertation in Oxford. She worked on Sicily, central western Mediterranean, on issues of cultural interaction, sort of colonization, so to say. And then afterwards, and start doing fieldwork in Çaltılar, the site you'll be hearing much more about in Lycia, Anatolia. Again, on issues of cultural interaction come out. So that's the constant element, but actually sort of moving from one part of the Mediterranean to the other. The constant element in all of that has been a focus on the Iron Age. So Iron Age archaeology is the central part of it. And there was also a book that's, has cropped up at quite a few places in classes, at least some classes that I've been teaching. That was published in 2006, Local Responses to Colonization in the Iron Age. After that, she's been moving on in somewhat different fields, and particularly globalization is sort of the key term that summed it up. There's a couple of articles she published, 2009, 2010, and an edited book on those issues. But especially there's a big book, and here you need really sort of two uppercases. That's coming out. She edited the Routledge Handbook of Archaeology and Colonization, which is a massive volume that has a global coverage with archaeologists covering sort of, well, really the whole of the world in about 60 chapters, I thought. And this is, for those of us who have been involved in that sort of undertakings, it's a Herculean task. But it's also coming to an end, or has more or less come to an end.
It's at the printers now.
It's at the printer. So this will be able to stop some doors in a couple of months' time.
I actually refer to those as door stops rather than handbooks, because they cannot possibly fit in your hand.
But that project's actually finished, and with that, at the moment, Tamar is on sabbatical this year, and she's gone back to her earlier work on the Iron Age. She had begun work on a book on covering the whole of the Mediterranean Iron Age, and throughout this year she's working on that. Because she's on sabbatical for this year, she's actually coming to the Institute on two separate occasions, today, and will be here for the rest of the week or until Friday, and she's coming back then again in the spring, where she will treat us to another lecture. And the precise dates of that second visit still need to be decided. For tonight, the focus is, as you can see, on Çaltılar, a specific site in Anatolia, the Archaeological Project to discover ancient Lycia. Tamar, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'd like to thank you all for arranging such delightful weather. It's been marvelous. So I want to begin with a little story from Herodotus. In Book 1, he tells us about the Persian conquest of Western Anatolia during the middle of the 6th century BCE. After conquering Lydia and Caria, Cyrus's Median general, Harpagus, continued south to Lycia, and I now quote, "When Harpagus led his army into the plain of Xanthos, the Lycians came out to meet him and showed themselves courageous, fighting few against many. But, being beaten and driven into the city, they gathered their wives and children and goods and servants into the Acropolis, and then set the whole Acropolis on fire. Then they swore great oaths to each other, and, sallying out, fell fighting, all the men of Xanthos. Of the Xanthians who claim now to be Lycians, the greater number, all except 80 households, are of foreign descent. These 80 families, as it happened, were away from the city at that time and thus survived. So Harpagus gained Xanthos, and thereby annexed Lycia into the Persian Empire as well. It is widely assumed that those 80 families were in the Isla, which is the Turkish term for summer pastures. And I have a very fixed definition of this, so please bear with me. The Isla has been defined as a place to go for a definite period during the summer for the grazing of animals, conducting agricultural practices, supplying livelihood or even rest, which lies outside of the subsistence boundaries of a village, is usually joint property of a village, and, although far away, is wholly or partially tied to that area with socio-economic connections or a secondary area added to a village's actual subsistence area. You got that, right? That all makes perfect sense. In other words, there is a social and practical symbiosis between a village and its yaila, its upland counterpart. And this symbiosis exists today in the modern Turkish region of Lycia, between the major coastal towns of Antalya and Fethiye, and the upland pasture regions at the top of the Xanthos River Valley system. The Sekki Basin is the first one that you reach from Fethiye, and it has an altitude of 1,250 meters above sea level. This and its neighboring plateaus are nestled between high mountains that lead to the Turkish Lake District province of Burdur. Although the summers are hot, the air is dry rather than humid. Many of the summer residents live in Antalya or Fethiye during the winters, using the yaila as their holiday retreats from the heat, humidity, and invading tourists of the coastal plain. And this residential relationship between the coast and the yaila is reflected in settlement names in both regions. For example, villages and quarters around Fethiye share common names with several small settlements in the Sekki yaila. There's Esenkoy, and then there's Esenkoy in the yaila. There's Patlangic, which is a suburb of Fethiye, and then there's Yaila Patlangic. But most tellingly is Kinnik, which is actually the modern name for Xanthos village, and it has a corresponding yaila counterpart that is the first settlement you reach from the upland, in the upland from the coast. The pastoral origin of the yaila coastal symbiosis may be seen in other names like Çobanlar, which means shepherds, and a yaila village Çobanisa, so it's that same root of Çoban. Çaltılar is one typical yaila village located in the Sekki Plateau with its own lowland equivalent of Çaltıozu in the Xanthos Valley, part of Fethiye. And you can see the ancient site to the south of the modern village, which is this right here. Everybody see that? Yes? Okay. So in the modern village, in a 2009 census, reports the population of about 484 people. The reality is that there are only about 50 families that actually live there year-round. They're mostly elderly people. For the families with children, live in Antalya or Fethiye, returning to the yaila during the summer months and swelling the village population. Today, the village sits along the D350, which is the main route between Fethiye and Antalya across the mountains. You can either go along the wiggly coastal route or over the mountains. And this road, this mountain road, has been a major transit route between the coast and the interior of the country for centuries. An Ottoman bridge near the base of Oynawanda reflects one relatively modern crossing point over the river. And in fact, you can see, so here's the Ottoman bridge, and I'm the short one. Here's the Ottoman bridge. There's the modern highway behind it. There you go. That's the modern highway. That's the Ottoman bridge. Right at this juncture as well is a Roman inscription that indicates that this was the crossing during the 1st century CE as well. Further north, closer to the town of Suud, is a Hellenistic Watchtower. So this suggests that this has been a transit route for a very long time. And even earlier may be the obsidian blade on the right-hand side, which was retrieved from our intensive survey of Çaltılar Archaeological and which originates in Nenizidza, which is in southern Cappadocia, some 460 kilometers to the northeast. This is one of two major obsidian sources of central Anatolia that was exploited from the Epipaleolithic onwards, and during the Neolithic in particular, when obsidian was being used by communities throughout Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant. We cannot say when this date belongs to, but the working of it looks very Aegean according to our lithic specialist, who is Tristan Carter. We also don't know if this blade was worked in the Aegean and transported back to Anatolia, or if it reflects Aegean techniques in use in Anatolia. But whichever, the example indicates that this yaila zone served at least as a conduit, as well as a consumer, between the interior zones of Anatolia and the Aegean for a considerable time. Our interest in Çaltılar developed as a question about the role this region played in relation to Anatolia and the Mediterranean in general, inspired by previous research we had done elsewhere. Lycia sits at the corner between Anatolia, the Aegean, and the wider Mediterranean at large. As such, it occupies a unique geographical setting between land and sea, for it is a crucial junction between long-distance sea voyages and shorter, more localized journeys, and it is the cornerstone of the landmass of Anatolia, where the mountains reach the sea. But for much of its history of occupation, Lycia is a black hole for scholarship. Archaeologically, the region is best known for its Greco-Roman city-states, especially those named as members of the Roman period Lycian League, like Xanthos, Patara, and Slos. Anyone who has taken a tour of Lycia will be familiar with these sites. So we know that the League favored a federal means of governance, sharing resources, and rotating annually in which city the Senate convened to elect the Lysiarch. And indeed, these sites are the major tourist attractions of the region. Prior to this, Lycia's early Bronze Age has been well documented by Machtald Melling's excavations of the settlement and cemetery at Karataş Semayuk near Elmali. But from the Middle Bronze Age to the Classical period, hardly anything is known of the archaeology of Lycia. Only sporadic soundings and occasional late Iron Age tombs, such as Kizabel and Karaburun, give us isolated insight into the material culture of Lycia during the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st millennia BCE, and to date, no stratified contexts of these periods have been excavated. So what do we know about this period historically, or about this area historically? The region only became known as Lycia during the Roman period, when the coastal and upland city-states united to form the Lycian League. Prior to this time, Luca lands were coastal, while the eastern upland zone was known as Milias and includes the Elmali Plain, and the western zone was known as Kabalia. These names are thought to derive from Hittite names, Mira and Kualia. But boundaries fluctuated over time. We know that at times during the Bronze Age, the Luca lands extended as far as Konya. Ultimately, the long-term notion of the Luca may simply pertain to territories of Luwian speakers. But more specifically, we first hear about Lycia possibly in the chronicle of the late 15th century Hittite king Tutulia II, who lists it among his West Anatolian enemies forming the Asua coalition. I say it's listed because the list starts with something uka, and the L, the L, is a restored interpretation. But the list ends with Wulusia and Taruisa, which are generally accepted by scholarship to refer to Ilion and Troy. So scholars have sought a geographical order for that list, running from south to north. But the list is difficult to reconcile in geographic order, so this is not a completely secure reference. During the 14th century, according to the Amarna letters, the Luca people are characterized as commando-style sea raiders of the coastal communities. So during the 14th century, the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten complained to the king of Alassia, Cyprus, about raids by pirates conducted on his coastal cities by people from the Luca lands. Akhenaten accuses the Alassian people of aiding and abetting their adventures, to which the Alassian king responds that his country too was suffering from Luca raids. The very late 14th century Uluburun shipwreck may be another casualty of Luca piracy, all this time closer to home. We know that the ship sank astonishingly quickly, for a complement of anchors was found in situ. This means that they were not jettisoned by the crew, which would otherwise be the first action for a vessel in distress. This implies that the crew might have been otherwise occupied, possibly, and I throw this out very loosely, in hand-to-hand combat against a piratical raid. It's not beyond the realms of possibility, although natural disasters, such as the rocky coastline, should not be underestimated. And it is most likely that natural disasters sunk the Gelidonia wreck nearly 2 centuries later. In Egyptian texts pertaining to Ramses II, at the end of the 13th century, we learn about soldiers from the Luca lands who fought alongside the Hittites against the Egyptian in the Battle of Kadesh in 1274. But by the end of the 13th century, Hittite texts speak of Hittite campaigns against the Luca lands. The Luca are also mentioned as one of the sea peoples who invaded Egypt along with the other so-called sea peoples at the very end of the 13th century. So our relationship between these coastal dwellers, clearly coastal dwellers, they're sea pirates, and the upland zone is first assessed by our good friend Herodotus. He states, I'm sorry about this, he states that the Lycians were from Crete in ancient times, and he talks of a dispute in Crete about the royal power between the sons of Europa, one named Sarpedon and the other Minos. Minos prevailed in this dispute and drove out Sarpedon and his partisans, who, after being driven out, came to the Melian land in Asia. Herodotus continues, please forgive me. What is now possessed by the Lycians was in the past Milian, and the Millians were then called Ptolemy. I should add that Strabo, writing in the time of Augustus, so 1st centuries BCE, CE, says that the Cabalians were said to be Ptolemy, so we now have Cabalia mixed in there. So one might begin to wonder what is in a name. Okay, these are often political monikers that do not necessarily map straight onto social or material practices. Okay, so Herodotus continues. For a while, Sarpedon ruled them, and the people were called Termili, which was the name that they had brought with them, and that is still given to the Lycians by their neighbors. But after Lycus, son of Pandion, came from Athens, banished as well by his brother Aegeus, to join Sarpedon in the land of Termili, they came in time to be called Lycians after Lycus. Right? We're all with that? We've got changing names. A multilingual stele from Xanthos in Lycian and Greek has the equivalent of Lycia in the Greek text as Trimis in the Lycian. So that brings back this idea of Termili, it's all in the roots. As Machteld Melling has surmised, the Greek custom of calling the classical Termilii as Lycians must have been due to the persistence of Bronze Age and Homeric usage when Greeks began to Hellenize the name Luca into the Greek Lykioi. Thus, by the time of Homer, these people are the Lykioi or the Lycians. In the Trojan War, the Lycians are named as one of the principal allies of the Trojans, led by Sarpedon, a different one to the mythical founder offered by Herodotus. They're led by Sarpedon and Glaucus. In the Iliad, the Lycians feature for their Aristeia, a warrior's prowess or excellence and virtue, and that's exhibited in the death of Sarpedon, which is on the screen now. While in the Glaucus episode, in which Glaucus and Diomedes exchange armor, the Xenia, or ritualized friendship, bind Greek and Lycian families together, forcing them to refrain from combat against one another. In Homer's epic tale, Apollo is their god. Not only does Glaucus pray to Apollo for strength, but it is Apollo who rescues and prepares Sarpedon's body for return to and burial in Lycia. Furthermore, we are told that the Lycians speak Greek. Okay, there's the Lycian inscription here. That's running along there. Just make it out. So we're told that the Lycians speak Greek, but we know that the Lycian language is related to Luwian, so an element of myth history license has to be assumed. That's it. That's what's known. That's it. So we began our investigations at Çaltılar in 2008 as a means of understanding the social and cultural developments of Lycia in these intervening periods, and to assess the role that Lycia played between Anatolia and the Aegean, given the textual references to the Luca and the Lycians, the Cabalians and the Millians, by the Egyptians, Hittites, Greeks of the Bronze and Iron Ages. Our project was a collaboration between Bristol and Liverpool universities in the UK and Uludağ University in Bursa in Turkey, and it was facilitated by the British Institute at Ankara. Research funding was provided by the British Academy and the Institute for Aegean Prehistory, as well as our respective universities and several private donors, and Lycia Wines very kindly provided us with sponsorship in kind. Someone asked me about that at the reception. There's a good story there. Çaltılar Archaeological is situated just south of the village. The mound itself covers an area of about 30,000 meters squared, just a little under 3 hectares, about 3 hectares. As you can see, the area immediately around the mound is very fertile, and it is used for a diverse range of agricultural produce, including plums, apples, tomatoes, cucumbers, corn, chickpeas, and wheat. And the lush and fertile region may also be referred to indirectly in ancient literary sources. Homer tells us that Sarpedon and Glaucus owned fields and vineyards in the Xanthos Valley, and that this contributed to their source of wealth. The assumed relationship between this Isla region and the Xanthos Valley encourages us to muse that maybe these lands here also contributed to the agrarian wealth of the Lycian heroes. It's very hard work being a farmer up there. It is commonly assumed that transhumance was practiced in antiquity, much as it was during the Ottoman period, when Western scholars first began to travel to Turkey and marvel and plunder its ruins. While it is doubtful that ancient and Ottoman transhumance practices were the same, many do believe that a form of transhumance between the coast and upland did take place in antiquity. The presence of Lycian-style tombs in the Cabalis and Milius regions imply the movement of people and their burial practices, and an inscription resolving a land rights dispute between Tlos in the lower Xanthos and Oinoanda in the upland indicate a conflict at the period arising from the encroachment of herders from one city onto the agricultural land of the other. The site was first recorded in 1988 as part of Jim Coulton's Balboa survey, and in 1990 the site and its environs were declared a protected archaeological area. Between 1990 and 2008, the only archaeological activity was the occasional collection of surface finds by staff members of the Fethiye Museum. We began with an assessment of the extent of the site itself. Judging by the nature and quantity of visible material in the fields immediately adjacent to the Huyuk, we observed a sudden drop-off in material to the east and west of the visible mound edges. To the north and south, however, the fields were rich in pottery. Much of the Iron Age material, especially that recovered from lower levels of the mound, appear very worn from water and erosion, and this is in contrast to the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age sherds from the same context, suggesting that the later material had been exposed for some time, perhaps washing down from the upper levels. It also implies that occupation in the Iron Age may have been less extensive than in earlier periods. We then conducted a topographic survey to map the shape of the Huyuk itself. Using a total station, this was 2008, we gathered a total of 3,200 individual measurements. This survey revealed a series of cultivation terraces over the surface of the mound. We also conducted an intensive survey overlaying a grid system and doing a systematic total collection of all visible artifacts from a series of 5 by 5 meter squares. In our first year alone, we collected, washed, and processed over 14,000 sherds and recovered almost 400 other finds, including flint blades, quern, slag, and the occasional shotgun casing and donkey shoe. By the end of our 2009 season, those figures had swelled by an additional 18,700 sherds and 580 additional finds, bringing our total to 33,000 sherds and 1,000 other artifacts. The volume of material from any given square was largely determined by recent post-excavation activities, mostly plowing. For areas that had been plowed, most recently, had a higher proportion of sherds. But molehills also assisted in the process of bringing material to the surface. Do not underestimate rodent activity on site. Some of our other activities included a survey of spolia, reused worked stone in and around the village. We also examined current potting practices in the region, including clay collection, sieving and tempering, pot making and decorating, seasonality, commercial exploitation, and gender roles to complement our research on ancient clay manufacturing techniques and technologies, to further production choices, firing conditions, and other aspects of pottery production. For the duration of the project, each year we have also held a series of outreach activities, including public presentations on our work and finds, and creating a mock grid to enable the children of the village to participate in intensive survey collection. We've also held more informal conversations with members of the village to find out what they hope the results of our research might bring to their village, and to ascertain and what they think of our presence and our work. Namely, they are interested in the potential for economic expansion deriving from tourism and improved infrastructure that such development will necessitate. The earliest ceramic material found on the surface of the site may be assigned to the late Chalcolithic period, so it's second half of the 4th millennium BCE. This material is all handmade and shaft tempered. The surface is often burnished, but not always. A dark burnished and white painted example finds its closest parallels to late Chalcolithic material from Beyce Sultan and Aphrodisias, and has a fabric that is distinctive in comparison with other dark burnished white painted examples recovered from the site and which have been assigned as early Bronze Age date. There is also evidence of substantial occupation during the early Bronze Age, so the 3rd millennium. It is not clear whether the site was occupied in the early Bronze Age, early Bronze Age 1, but we have plenty of evidence for extensive occupation during EB2 and possibly EB3 phases. The wares include gray-black to buff burnished, dark gray-black burnished ware with white painted decoration, red burnished with white painted decoration, pale gray burnished micaceous ware, incised ware, and relief ware. Many of these are handmade, but some fragments belong to wheel-thrown vessels. The evidence of imports during this time can be seen particularly with the micaceous ware, which originates in the Denizli-Menderes Massif area, which is hundreds of kilometers away, while other examples come from Elmali, which is the next upland plateau to the east. We have also identified for the first time in this upland region evidence of 2nd millennium occupation, so pertaining to the Middle and Late Bronze Ages. What we have is very small in quantity and lacks sufficient diagnostic characteristics that could allow for more precise dating, but this evidence is nevertheless extremely important because archaeological remains of the second millennium in Lycia and elsewhere in southwest Turkey are relatively rare and not widely known. Our petrographic analysis indicates that a number of these were also imported, including from the Denizli Menderes Massif and the area around Elmali. The overwhelming majority of those 33,000 sherds dates to the Iron Age, specifically the 10th to the 6th centuries BCE. Most date to the Middle and Late Iron Age, so roughly the 9th to 6th century, although some could be proto-geometric, which would indicate possibly 10th century occupation. Without stratigraphic data, however, we can still only estimate. It is large and highly decorated vessels that characterize our Iron Age assemblage, and it is clear that a number of these have been imported to the site from elsewhere in Anatolia, including Phrygia, Lydia, and several production centers in western Anatolia and the islands. From Phrygia comes this piece, with decorative motifs comparable to examples from the ornate class of brown on buff at Gordian of the late 8th and early 7th centuries. Our black on red may imply links further east, for the homeland of black on red is often considered to lie in Cyprus or the Near East. Sporadic fine and medium black on red examples have been found in a number of sites in western Anatolia, like Sardis, Ephesus, and Kalisa Tepe. Production is more likely to be from closer to home, perhaps Rhodes or the Anatolian mainland itself, rather than Cilicia, Cyprus, or the Near East, because the clay does not match Eastern Mediterranean wares. We also have what appears to be an example of Lydian marbled ware, a group produced at Sardis during the 6th century. Our Iron Age imports from Greece include production suspects like Athens, Euboea, Corinth, and East Greece. This example may be from Euboea. It's articulated in a manner reminiscent of Euboean painting techniques, and its surface treatment is typical of Euboean late geometric, but its biscuit is not as clean. Our Corinthian is not very photogenic, but it's definitely Corinthian. Our Attic pottery is even less photogenic because they're just plain body sherds, so I'm not showing them, but they are definitely Attic. You can't doubt that. East Greece is also a significant source of decorated pottery at Çaltılar, this example of unknown origin, whereas this example probably comes from Chios with its characteristic thick cream slip over a pinkish fabric. Our wild goat finds suggest broader Western Anatolian production, although at this stage we cannot pinpoint exactly where. This piece depicts a possible griffin head, trust me when I say that, with a complex swastika filling ornament rendered in a style typical of Middle Wild Goat II, which would suggest a late 7th century date. This example shows the outline hind leg and hoof of an animal, which is notable because silhouette is the common method of depicting animal legs with cloven feet. I have yet to identify the center that produced this particular style, so if anybody happens to know or has a parallel, please let me know. We also have a notable collection of large, thickly slipped vessels that find similarities to other 8th and 7th century Western Anatolian outputs. These are generally called Southwest Anatolian ware. Some have a distinctive thick white slip, others the slip is more pink, and we have a group of red slip with added white and black rather than white slip with added red and black. Now each of these is petrographically discrete, which suggests several production centers were exporting their wares to Çaltılar. Or perhaps a better way to describe it is that the residents of Çaltılar were importing material from a number of different production centers in western and southwestern Anatolia. I actually have a grant from the British Institute at Ankara to do PXRF on their collection of Southwest Anatolian ware, which I'll be doing at the end of November and beginning of December, this to see if we can build on this petrographic discretion between these groups that I've identified at Çaltılar. No one's ever said anything other than it's Southwest Anatolian ware, so it's significant. These wares, those that were considered macroscopically as local because of their ubiquity and longevity at the site, they are from the Bronze Age all the way through the Iron Age, in fact fall within 4 main petrographic groups, with origins from as close as the basin itself to as far away as the Denizli Menderes Massif, as I've said, several hundred kilometers away. Visually, with the naked eye, we are unable to distinguish between the clays themselves when looking at the fabrics. This is as true for our Bronze Age assemblage as our Iron Age, and this suggests that much of the material we had, originally considered local, comes not only from our immediate upland basin, but also regionally, and is related to a geographic koine in affinity with wares produced elsewhere in southwestern Turkey over the lifespan of the site. Notable, therefore, is the fact that the late Iron Age table wares that we subjected to petrographic analysis which we selected to cover the visually observed range of fabric types, including types we deemed local and types that we knew were likely imports from Western Anatolia. They come almost entirely and specifically from the Denizli and the Menderes Massif zone. This is suggestive of the nature of Çaltılar's socio-commercial relations during the 7th and 6th century. And these late Iron Age drinking vessels are in fact the latest in our sequence. Little material can be dated to after the middle of the 6th century. Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic wares account for less than 1% of the total assemblage. With no classical period wares recovered from the site, Çaltılar settlement history, as suggested by the pottery, implies that occupation ceased during the middle of the 6th century. This coincides very neatly with the historical date of the Persian annexation of Lycia. Do you remember the story I began with? Herodotus' dramatic account of the destruction of Xanthos that led to the Persian annexation of Lycia? Do you remember those 80 families who were not at Xanthos at the time but elsewhere, perhaps in the Isla? So here's my question. Could Çaltılar have been a place where those 80 Lycian families sought refuge when Harpagus laid siege to Xanthos and conquered Lycia? I throw that out there. But what is most striking about our Iron Age assemblage is the imported wares. We were surprised by the sheer number collected from the surface alone and their production origins from as far away as Phrygia and Lydia all the way to Greece for a relatively small site on a very modest upland plateau. Furthermore, these are large and elaborately decorated vessels. So it raises an immediate question. Would you really haul your high-status, imported, large and heavy pottery all the way from the coast for the summer season in your Isla village? The status value associated with imported pottery in general has further made us wonder if Çaltılar served a different function during the early 1st millennium BCE, rather than just as a summer pastoral residence for coastal dwellers as it is today. To consider this further, let's turn to our geophysical results. The geophysical surveys conducted in 2008 and 2009 did suggest an area with anomalous features in the northern sector of the site. So it's this structure right here. This is due precisely to the way in which the surface of the mound has been plowed, which has caused deep soil lynchets to accumulate. So at Çaltılar, the lynchets have accumulated on the southern slopes, which leaves the archaeology closest to the surface in the northern end. Therefore, the shadows seem to indicate something other than the field system, which is clearly visible elsewhere on the mound. And you can, as I say, can make out an elongated line. Where's my arrow? An elongated line here, but it's particularly this structure right here. It's rectilinear shape, oriented northeast-southwest, and these represent a series of stone-built structures of considerable size. This one, the main one, is rectilinear that appears to be 10 meters by 20 meters, and what at this stage we might describe as a set of walls. There are some other features. Where's my arrow gone? Come back, arrow, here. So features along here. Might be a set of walls, and then this particular structure. To explore this feature more substantially without excavating, we are on a survey permit, which means we cannot scratch the ground with a trowel. We can only pick up what is on the surface. So without excavating, in 2010, we conducted an electrical tomography survey. This method allows vertical slices through the subsoil stratigraphy to a depth of several meters. The system we were using appears to have achieved good results up to a maximum depth of 4 meters. We took an intensive sequence of north-south profiles at 1 meter intervals. In these, the anomaly was clearly visible from the surface of the mound down to a depth of about 2.5 meters consistently across its whole area. And these results are consistent with this anomaly being the remains of a stone-built structure of considerable size and depth. And it's likely that the walls are preserved to a height of 2.5 meters, but underground. So you can't see it, but there are stone walls that are 2.5 meters high, just under the surface. There is, of course, nothing from these surveys to indicate the date of this structure, or its function, or even its construction technique, except to say that it's made of stone. So what is it? given that the pottery collected from the survey strongly suggests that occupation at the site ceased around the time of the Persian conquest, whatever these structures are, they are likely to predate the middle of the 6th century. Large stone-walled buildings like this tend to be associated with the late Iron Age, or the Archaic period in Greek terms, maybe as early as the 8th century BCE, generally speaking. And a temple or fortification are the two most obvious possibilities. With no sites in Lycia with well-defined pre-classical strata, we have to look further afield for parallels. This does not leave us many known options, and I also acknowledge that the following ideas of possible parallels are wild speculation. In terms of dates, the most structures of this size that are stone-built date to not before the middle of the 8th century. The inner defense platform of Old Smyrna, for instance, seems to have been laid during the second half of the 8th century. Inner defense platform actually refers to a great fill of mostly river stones bedded in clay mortar. It was encompassed by a wall built of river stones to a substantial height with a mud brick superstructure, as this drawing reconstruction illustrates. Nichols believes that it served as a modest fortress just inside the city, controlling access to the circuit wall and to the defenses of the northeast gate. Although its name alludes to a military purpose, right, inner defense platform, it may also be evidence for a late geometric temple based upon votive evidence. This part of the site also developed into the principal cult place of the city. It's also during this period that the first ramp was constructed up to the platform. Now, we may have a ramp at Çaltılar, that strange line hanging down from my 10 by 20 meter building, although it's very difficult to say for sure what it is without excavating. The site of Aegean, near the shores of the Black Sea, we're really getting far away for parallels, but there are just not that many of this period, is another fortified site with similar rectangular structures. The origin of the fortress itself is usually dated to the early or mid-6th century, but the site's local wares derive from the Central Anatolia Alishar IV sequence, which is 9th and 8th centuries BCE. And the site imported a notable amount of Milesian wild goat and other so-called East Greek types during the 7th and 6th centuries. So it may be that Çaltılar was something similar, although any further discussion about the precise nature of the site would have to be purely speculative. Nevertheless, our results have illuminated a number of features of Lycia's past. Although the area serves as a Isla today, our results suggest strongly that Çaltılar itself was something much more substantial than a seasonal destination. This is certainly the case for the Iron Age, given that it was a hub for large, ornately decorated, expensive, and high-status pottery vessels from a variety of origins near and far, and that there is a substantial stone structure here with walls at least 2.5 meters high. A claim for similarly established and far-reaching connectivity may also be made for at least the early Bronze Age, given the quantity of imported material during that phase of occupation. Nevertheless, our results already overturn general assumptions made by Bean, Harrison, and others about the role this region might have played in the past, especially that it acted as a Isla, although it does not exclude the possibility that it nevertheless maintained a symbiotic relationship of some sort with the coastal settlements. Perhaps the 80 families who were away from Xanthos when Harpagus laid siege were in this area, but whether it was explicitly to seek refuge in a sanctuary or fortified site, or for some other reason, we can only muse upon. Whether the site was a sanctuary or fortified settlement, or both or other, and how it changed over time, we can only determine further by excavation of its stratified context. Above all, however, our results indicate that the region itself, in its pre-Greco-Roman eras, was something much more significant on the road through Turkey's southwestern land corner, and that it played a major role in connecting the populations around the Mediterranean shores with the kingdoms of Anatolia. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this great overview of the project and things you've come across. There's lots of connection points, so questions?
Two questions. The first, very brief. Are you able to keep at least a portion of the pottery or all of the pottery and store it somewhere, or did you have to put it back?
So I'm very glad that you've asked that. Sorry, I don't mean to sound like Hillary Clinton. I'm very glad that you've asked that, but I am, because everything to do with this is a leading lecture. There are many questions that I'm sure I will get. Doing archaeology in Turkey is inherently political. It's extremely highly regulated, and Turkish law states that all material must stay on the site. So we did in fact construct storage facilities. We took over the old schoolhouse. There are not enough children to sustain a school. So we use the schoolhouse as our base. We have dedicated storage facilities. The material is sealed there on the site in our dig house area. And this is because it can't be in a museum, because the museums are bursting to the seams with material from other excavations. So increasingly in recent years, the burden of responsibility, I take back the burden. The responsibility of storage has fallen squarely on the shoulders of the projects themselves. So the material is sealed. It is not accessible at the moment. Although it might, well, no, not accessible to us at any rate. That's part of the political issue.
Not on the grounds. And my other question is about the imports of the material from Ionia. I'm curious, is it largely tableware, or do you have examples of other sort of coarser things? Or?
It's very difficult to say right now. It's the decorated wares are the ones that really jump out. So those are going to be your highly elaborate examples. Because it was a survey project and we didn't have a lot of time to do it, the history of the project is that in 2011 we applied for an excavation permit. Again, under Turkish regulations, you need to survey a site before you can move to excavation. You cannot just swoop in and say, I want to dig here. So we did our due diligence. We did our survey in 2008, 9, 10, applied for an excavation permit for 2011. 2011 was also the year that Erdogan was running for a third time and running a particularly nationalistic campaign, and that was also the year in which no foreigner got a new excavation permit. And to this day, no British project will get an excavation permit or even a museum permit, because the Turks want back two arguably obscure pieces. One is in the British Museum, one is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, for which both museums have the permissions, they have the firmans from the Ottoman authorities who legally sold and exported the material, which is a little surprising because it's not the Nereid monument that is sitting in the British Museum that you would think they would want back. It's something actually quite minor and insignificant from an academic, intellectual perspective, but of course it's hugely symbolic for Turkey. So to this day, we can't do anything more.
Yes.
Well, you're obviously an American.
Yes.
Could you apply for a permit as an American? And what are the prospects of getting it?
It has to do with my institution. So because I'm based at the University of Bristol, right, it's viewed as a British project regardless of my nationality. And again, it's very difficult to get new excavation permits. And again, it becomes very political. In the last few years, the two well-known projects, one is a joint Italo-Turkish project at Carchemish, which was negotiated when Berlusconi was still in power, and Berlusconi and Erdogan were good friends. A telephone call was placed from Berlusconi to Erdogan, and lo and behold, renewed excavations at Carchemish, joint Italian-Turkish project. The other big renewal of concession was the University of Pennsylvania and their rights, so to speak, for Gordian. And that was on the basis of the return of material from the Penn Museum that was negotiated by the State Department. The British view is that archaeology is not part of the Foreign Office. We are not funded, the British schools are not funded by the Foreign Office. The German archaeological institutes are funded directly by the German Foreign Office. State Department negotiates on behalf. The British take a very different view, so no.
Would you partner with a Turk?
So that's another part of the regulations of Turkey. These are great questions. I'm so glad you guys are asking them. So again, as Turkey has done a lot to actually break down the colonialism of plunder and that long tradition of Westerners coming in and pillaging Turkish artifacts. So a number of years ago, they created a regulation that says that any project you have to have a Turkish co-director. Now, in fact, when we set up our project, we have a Turkish co-director. She's the one based at Bursa University, Uludağ University in Bursa. And that was before this regulation came into place. So we viewed it as a good thing. We wanted to. It's almost in anticipation of that regulation coming in. Then we fell foul of internal Turkish academic issues. So Turkey is very regionalized, provincialized. She is under pressure to do research in her province, not in Lycia. And at the time, she didn't have the docent status to allow her to be the permit holder. You have to have a certain level. Here you'd have to be, I guess, an associate professor in order to be the permit holder. So at the time, she didn't have that status, so she could not be the permit holder. So yeah, we're stymied there too. We did actually continue work. It didn't all grind to a halt in 2011. In 2012, we had one final study season for Çaltılar, and we started a new phase of 3 years of work at a neighboring mound called Çaltılar Archaeological, where we employed similar principles. We mapped the mound. We didn't do a complete total pickup. We didn't do the whole site. We still did our 5 by 5 meter grids. We still did the intensive survey, but we did it in selective strips. And actually, there's a very marked difference in the quality of material that we found at Çaltılar, where we didn't have as many of those imported, large, high-status vessels as we found at Çaltılar. It was much more utilitarian, very few imports. The site continues into the Roman period, although there is a gap. There is a gap in occupation, actually around that the Balboa survey first identified. After this Persian invasion or Persian annexation until the Roman period, there's actually very little that we can identify of classical early Hellenistic. So that has yet to be identified, but it seems to be a region-wide situation. So we did continue work at Çaltılar, hoping that the restrictions might be lifted. Instead, the government passed a regulation that surveys could no longer collect anything from the ground. So that stopped every intensive survey dead in its tracks. And right, since we took samples, we had a permit in 2012 to take soil samples. And we had our colleague in Liverpool all set up to use his machine. And when we went down to Fethiye to get the permission from the agriculture department to export these soil samples, we were told no. 2 weeks before, the government had changed the rules and had decided that no material can be exported from Turkey if the analysis can be done in Turkey. We'd have to prove that there's nobody and no equipment capable of doing these analyses before we could have permission. We hadn't planned for that. If they'd said from next year, this will be the law, that's fine. We could have been proactive and set up those connections. Instead, we had to get the material up to Ankara, to the BIAA, to freeze it, while we then spent the winter months searching for possible collaborators, which we did find in Istanbul, at one of the universities in Istanbul, and they've been doing that analysis for us. But it's kind of the retrospective application of legislation that requires one to be nimble and not get frustrated. Any other questions? Yes?
I'd like to hear more about your team's interaction with the local villagers at Çaltılar. I mean, the response you mentioned was the one normally gets, which is what's in it for us.
Right, and the gold. Gold.
Where's the gold?
Right, always the gold.
Will this
And the tunnel from the mountain to the mound. There's always a tunnel and there's always gold. Yes.
But apart from hope for economic development that might arise from the development of the site, what do they have to? Well, first of all, what do they think you're up to? Especially since you're not digging, which everybody knows is the way to find gold.
Right.
And how do they relate to this mound? I mean, it's only 3 hectares, but it's a pretty prominent mound in the landscape.
Yeah, they use it.
A part of their. I mean, what do they think it is?
Yeah, they use it. It's a great place to go up with slingshots and shoot at birds. So that they use it as for target practice. It's a elevated plain. It is cultivated, so those are the stone walls that you see are actually modern field divisions. And what you can't see off the top of the north slope, because we're looking north, that actually we could see in the fields where they were plowing that there was some of this early Bronze Age material that they were churning up. It's there. It's just part of. It's always been there. In some cases, a sense of time it's just all in the past, and the strict chronological divisions that we assign is not something that's natural to them. Depends on how well educated they are. So the younger families whose kids have gone to school or are going to school, they have a better understanding. Those who have lived in Çaltılar all their lives, their education perhaps stopped in school and then they did their military service and have been farmers ever since. Not so, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to do that outreach. So the first season, we asked if we could rent a house in the village, and we were told there are no houses to rent. No, you cannot. Luckily, we knew somebody he was actually one of the staff members at the museum in Fethiye, had his Isla house a few villages over, so he let us stay there. So then the village got to know us and realized that we are not there to take their material back to Britain and somehow make profit from it at their expense. And after that, doors opened to us. We were rented accommodation. The village was very happy that we wanted to restore their school. And again, doing the outreach helped us explain chronology, the idea of stratigraphy, the difference between survey and excavation, and to point out your shotgun casings, this is why we know they use it for shooting, this is archaeology. What you do today and what you throw out today, we'll be digging up tomorrow. And you are part of the history of this. So we were extremely well welcomed. The local media came on a regular basis to film us and talk about the work. The reality is, this site is never going to generate tourism income. We do not have large standing buildings. 2.5 meter foundations, that's probably the best that we have. And again, the Turkish government, when you apply for a permit, they want to see a 10-year funding plan. So it harks back to the idea of a big dig that is so long gone it's impossible. But they also want to know what preservation plans you have in place to protect and preserve the site. So if we were to start excavating, we'd need to employ a guard to protect the site, but also what kind of tourism we are going to generate. And for me, I feel we're very lucky as an academic, as an archaeologist, we're lucky we don't have a large Greco-Roman city-state sitting on top of that, because also under Turkish law, you cannot remove an ancient wall. And that's why in the big city-states like Xanthos and Patara, they might only be able to do a small sounding to get to a lower level, but they cannot remove those walls. And anyone who's been to any of those city-states will know how substantial the buildings are and how substantial the foundations are. So it's right to be able to answer these questions about earlier periods without some of the hazards of trying to do this in a major Greco-Roman site. But because it's not Greco-Roman, it's not going to attract the tourists, and it's not a Göbekli Tepe. It's not going to be a Çatalhöyük. It's highly unlikely. And as a result, we also would be unlikely to get permission to excavate it because it's not going to be the type of site that will generate the tourism revenue. We are equidistant on the mountain road between Fethiye and Antalya, but it still takes an hour and a half to get up the hill from Fethiye. So, you have to really want to go there. And with all of the ecotourism, Lycia has developed huge ecotourism with the Lycian Way, but that doesn't come that far up. So it's the opportunities are very, very limited.
Yeah, on that, you've talked about the outreach programs, but have you tried any ethnography? Because it suggests that the stories about the tunnels and the gold and all that are more interesting than they seem.
So we actually do have someone, she's a postdoc, and she's been the postdoc at the British Institute at Ankara last year, actually working very much on the ethnographic aspect of the Çaltılar project. Her research, you can find out more about it on the BIA website, and she's got lectures as well and publications on it. So yes, we have done ethnographic work as well to tease out these stories, but there is a commonality amongst many sites about the gold and the tunnel, almost wherever you are in Turkey. Yes, yes. So I actually, my first experience of field work in Turkey was at a site called Kinethuyuk, where I worked from 1993 until 2003. And it's right on the Syrian border of Turkey, exactly where you do not want to be today. But again, even there was talk about where's the gold and a tunnel connecting the mound to the mountains. And so, yes, it is quite a common theme.
Anyone else? Other questions? So, otherwise, I think in that case we will continue the discussion over a glass of wine. So if you want to thank Tamar with me.
Thank you.